Welcome back, everyone. We've got a really important deep dive ahead of us today. It's one that honestly kind of hits close to home for a lot of us, I think.
Absolutely.
The material you sent over has us looking at some pretty heavy stuff.
Hmm.
Is America potentially on the edge of something? Well, something scary.
Yeah.
Are we really on a path towards fascism? And have we, the people, lost our grip on the government?
Those are some very serious questions.
Yeah. And we're going to be leaning heavily on Seth Abramson's analysis here, along with some other articles that paint some pretty stark pictures.
Right.
We've got pieces about mass civil disorder, comparisons to Orbán's Hungary, which, if you don't know, is not exactly a beacon of democracy, and, of course, all the buzz around Trump and his talk about a third term.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It is. And our goal today is to break all of this down, pull out the key takeaways, and hopefully give you a better understanding of what these sources suggest about where America stands right now.
A clearer picture, perhaps even if it's a bit unsettling.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. And the first thing that really jumps out, I think, is this whole idea of Trump and a potential third term. Abramson doesn't mince words. He pretty much says Trump's come clean about wanting this, that it's not just talk anymore.
He points to Trump's comments to NBC News as evidence. Remember when Trump said he wasn't joking about seeking a third term?
Oh, yeah, that was. Well, let's just say it got people's attention.
And he said he believes there are methods to get around the 22nd Amendment. So this isn't just a throwaway line. It's a signal that he might be seriously thinking about challenging constitutional limits.
And this whole thing about potentially running as VP with someone like J.D. Vance in 2028 and then taking over, it sounds like something out of a bad movie. Is that even remotely possible legally?
Well, most legal experts, as Abramson notes, say absolutely not.
Okay, good.
It's a pretty clear attempt to skirt the 22nd Amendment. But remember, this isn't the first time Trump has floated the idea of extending his presidency beyond the legal limits. He's talked about a fourth term before, too, and there's even a bill in Congress, though it's highly unlikely to pass, that would allow for a third term. This persistent focus on stretching presidential power is a major red flag for Abramson.
Okay.
Now, the New York Times has a slightly different take on this whole third-term talk. They think it might be more of a strategy for Trump to stay in the spotlight, so he's not seen as a lame duck in a potential second term. What do you think about that?
I think there's definitely some truth to that. It keeps him relevant, keeps his base energized, and maybe even makes potential challengers within his own party think twice.
Right.
But the downside is that it distracts from real policy discussions, further erodes public trust in our institutions, and normalizes this idea that constitutional norms are basically optional if they're inconvenient politically.
Yeah, that's not great.
Not great at all. And Jonathan Chait, writing in The Atlantic, makes this really interesting point. He says, what might have started as a joke now seems to be something Trump's inner circle is seriously entertaining, especially given his admiration for strongman leaders.
And Chait raises a fundamental point about constitutional limits. They're only effective if there's a willingness to enforce them. If that willingness fades or is actively undermined, the whole system becomes vulnerable. And that goes right to the heart of Abramson's worries about checks and balances eroding.
Which brings us to another major concern that Abramson highlights, this whole Davis doctrine. I'm not sure everyone's familiar with that. Can you kind of break it down for us?
Sure. So the Davis doctrine, as Abramson describes it, and as it's been promoted by Trump, basically argues that the president can ignore federal court rulings if they have anything to do with military operations, foreign policy, or, some kind of immediate danger to American lives.
So basically the president is above the law.
In those areas, yeah, that's the idea. It's a huge expansion of presidential power, and historically speaking, this is exactly the kind of thing checks and balances are meant to prevent. It raises a serious concern about a slide towards authoritarianism where the president's will trumps the rule of law.
Okay, so ignoring court rulings is bad enough. But then Abramson talks about plans to, and I'm quoting here, soft impeach judges by taking away their security clearances. What does that even mean?
It's called soft impeachment because it doesn't formally remove a judge from office like a real impeachment would.
Right.
But by revoking their security clearance, you basically prevent them from accessing classified information, which they need for many national security cases. So they're essentially sidelined without having to go through the whole messy process of a Senate trial.
So it's a way to get rid of judges you don't like without actually, getting rid of them.
Exactly. And Abramson also points to the strategy of impeaching judges in the House, where Republicans might have a majority, just to force them to recuse themselves, even if there's no chance of a conviction in the Senate.
It's all about intimidation, isn't it?
Yeah, it's creating this chilling effect where judges might think twice before ruling against the executive branch, knowing they could face these politically motivated attacks. It undermines judicial independence.
And Abramson brings up this Truth Social post from Trump where he calls judges part of a criminal network and says they're stopping him from doing his job.
Yeah, that was concerning, to say the least.
It's a direct attack on the legitimacy of the judicial system.
Absolutely. It erodes public trust in the courts, which are, a cornerstone of democracy. It creates this climate where people, especially Trump supporters, can just dismiss any ruling they don't like as biased or corrupt. And Abramson also talks about this idea of the judiciary becoming non-justiciable in certain areas.
Justiciable.
It means there are situations where the courts basically have no power to intervene, like with those ICE detentions designed to avoid judicial review. It's a way for the executive branch to shield its actions from any legal oversight.
Okay, so we've talked about potential threats to the presidency and the judiciary. Now let's zoom out a bit and look at Anne Applebaum's article in The Atlantic. She compares the admiration some on the American right have for Viktor Orbán's Hungary with the less glamorous reality of what's actually happening there. What do you think are the biggest takeaways from this comparison, especially in light of what Abramson is saying?
I think Applebaum's article is a huge warning sign. While Orbán's Hungary is often held up as this model for conservative governance, Applebaum shows us that it's actually riddled with corruption, its economy is stagnant despite all the nationalist rhetoric, and democratic institutions have been systematically dismantled.
And the really scary part is
That the methods Orbán used to consolidate power, things like replacing independent civil servants with loyalists, cracking down on the free press, undermining universities, politicizing the courts, and constantly changing the Constitution, those are the very things Abramson fears are happening here.
So it's not just about policies. It's about the playbook for how to gain and hold on to power, regardless of democratic norms.
Exactly. And Applebaum emphasizes that this isn't theoretical, it's happening. This erosion of civil service independence, the pressure on the media and universities, these are real-world tactics with real-world consequences.
And she talks about how corruption in Hungary is often legal, benefiting this small group of oligarchs she calls NER people. It's like the laws themselves are being used to enrich those in power and their cronies.
Right. Accountability and oversight disappear, and it becomes almost impossible to challenge the system. And then there's the Sovereignty Protection Office in Hungary, which is supposedly there to protect national interests, but it's really just used to harass and intimidate anyone who criticizes the government.
So basically, it's a tool to silence dissent.
Exactly. And Applebaum draws a clear parallel between what's happening in Hungary and what happened in the U.S. under Trump, particularly the trend towards populist governance and a politicized justice system.
Okay, this all seems to tie in with what Abramson calls his dozen paths to democratic collapse and mass civil disorder. It's a pretty bleak list, to be honest. Let's go through some of the most worrying ones. He talks about the high likelihood of constitutional crises because of Trump ignoring court rulings, which we already discussed with the Davis Doctrine. But what kind of ripple effects could that have?
Well, when a president openly defies the courts, it undermines the entire rule of law. It creates chaos and uncertainty, and it could even encourage others to disregard laws they don't like. Basically, the government loses its ability to enforce the law, and the whole system starts to break down.
That's a pretty fundamental problem. And then there's the possibility of Trump's party losing Congress in 2026 and him taking steps to prevent free and fair midterm elections. How could someone in power even try to do that?
There are a lot of ways, some more obvious than others. You could see more restrictions on voting access, especially for groups that are less likely to support the incumbent party. There could be attempts to interfere with how elections are run at the state and local levels, maybe by putting loyalists in key positions.
So basically, rigging the system from the inside.
Yeah. And then there are disinformation campaigns designed to make people distrust the whole electoral process. And in a more extreme scenario, you could even see attempts to challenge or overturn election results based on bogus claims of fraud, which could lead to a full-blown constitutional crisis.
And that's not even the worst of it. Abramson also talks about the possibility of Trump starting a preposterous war of choice.
Mm.
I mean, if a leader is feeling cornered and desperate to cling to power, how might that play out?
A preposterous war of choice, as Abramson puts it, would be a war started not because of a genuine national security threat, but for political reasons, to rally support, distract from domestic problems, or even to justify expanding executive power.
So basically using war as a political tool.
Yeah, which is incredibly dangerous. It risks countless lives and could have all sorts of unintended consequences globally.
And Abramson paints this really disturbing picture of what could happen if federal services start to crumble or become too politicized. Widespread dysfunction, mass protests, and potentially even martial law.
It's a slippery slope. If people lose faith in the government and basic services start to fail, it's not hard to imagine widespread unrest. And how the government responds to those protests is crucial. A move towards martial law, using the military to enforce domestic law, would be a radical departure from American norms and raise serious concerns about the suppression of civil liberties.
And then there's the question of Trump's mental fitness, which Abramson brings up as a factor. It's a touchy subject, but given all the other concerns, how does it fit in?
It's relevant because the president has so much power and responsibility. The decisions made at that level require sound judgment and a clear understanding of incredibly complex issues. Yeah. Any doubt about a president's cognitive abilities adds another layer of risk to an already unstable situation.
And Abramson argues that Trump has a very strong incentive to stay in power because he wants to avoid legal trouble after leaving office. Could that desperation push him to take even more drastic measures?
It's definitely a strong motivator. The possibility of facing legal consequences after leaving office could make someone do almost anything to stay in power, even things that damage democratic institutions and norms. The desire to avoid accountability can drive some pretty authoritarian behavior.
Abramson also highlights the unprecedented level of funding Trump and the Republican Party are getting from people like Elon Musk, who is openly afraid of a Democratic president. What kind of influence can that kind of concentrated wealth have on politics?
That much money can really amplify certain voices and agendas, and it can distort the political process. It can fund huge disinformation campaigns, influence what the media covers, and support candidates who align with the donors' interests. Abramson suggests that this level of funding, driven by a specific ideological goal, reinforces the feeling that the system is being controlled by a small group of powerful people, not by the will of the people.
And he even goes so far as to say there's been an effective legalization of bribery for Trump's allies. That's a pretty strong accusation. What's he basing that on?
He's likely talking about situations where ethical lines are blurred or completely ignored, and personal gain becomes intertwined with political favors. Think about things like lucrative government contracts going to allies or a lack of enforcement of regulations for those in power. When that kind of behavior becomes normal and accepted, it erodes the idea of public service and makes people feel like the system is rigged.
And then there's this whole thing about expanding mass deportations to include people with dissenting views and the possibility of indefinite detention in places like sea cots. It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel.
It raises serious concerns about basic human rights and freedoms. The idea of deporting people based on their political beliefs goes against the principles of free speech and due process. And indefinite detention without any legal recourse is a blatant violation of established legal and human rights standards. It suggests that the state could use its power in incredibly repressive ways.
And on top of all that, Abramson points to the dismantling of systems meant to protect us from national disasters, like pandemics, cyber attacks, and climate change. It's like the government is neglecting its most basic duty to keep people safe.
Yeah, a functioning government has a responsibility to protect its citizens from threats, and weakening or dismantling agencies and regulations designed to do that makes the country incredibly vulnerable. It suggests that short-term political goals are being prioritized over the long-term safety and well-being of the people.
Abramson also warns about the high risk of recession or stagflation, and the very real possibility of Trump trying to undermine potential successors and interfere with the 2026 elections because of his ambitions for a third term. It all feels very interconnected and incredibly worrying.
It's a cascade of interconnected risks. Economic instability can fuel social unrest and make people more open to extremist ideas. And the pursuit of an illegal third term, as Abramson points out, isn't just a future threat, it's distorting our politics right now, damaging the legitimacy of elections and sowing division. And then you add the potential for things like fabricated terror attacks or elections being compromised through cyber warfare or vote buying, and it becomes clear that the threats to democratic stability are coming from multiple directions. And the fact that so many voices of reason and moderation are silent right now is especially troubling. It allows those more extreme narratives to take hold.
Finally, I want to talk about Abramson's analogy to the Lord of the Rings. He compares the fragmented state of American society to the different races in Middle-earth and says we need a united front against authoritarianism, with Trump and Musk as Sauron and Saruman. What do you think of that comparison?
Well, all analogies have their limits, but I think the underlying message is important.
Hmm.
We need unity against this perceived threat to our democracy. Abramson is highlighting the dangers of division and the importance of different groups coming together to defend democratic principles. And comparing certain figures to classic villains, well, maybe a bit dramatic, underscores how serious he thinks the situation is and how high the stakes are right now. The fact that there's so much fragmentation and infighting among those who oppose these trends is definitely a big challenge.
This has been a really heavy deep dive. I mean, we've talked about some pretty dark stuff. The possibility of an illegal third term, the erosion of checks and balances, the similarities to autocratic regimes like Hungary, and all those pathways to democratic collapse and civil unrest that Abramson lays out.
The sources paint a pretty bleak picture of a deliberate effort to undermine American democracy, from challenging constitutional limits to attacking the courts and suppressing dissent. The comparison to Hungary shows us that democratic institutions can erode gradually, but the consequences are profound and lasting.
So thinking about everything we've discussed today, about the possibility of America going down the same path as those autocratic regimes, and the very real threat of a breakdown in our constitutional norms, what part of our democracy do you think is most at risk right now? And what does losing that mean for the future? It's a tough question, but it's one we have to ask ourselves after looking at all of this. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. I know it was heavy, but it's so important to be aware of these issues. Keep thinking critically about all of this and come to your own conclusions.